30,000 feet above the ocean, the cabin lights were low and soft, like a city after midnight. Most passengers were half asleep, curled under thin airline blankets, headphones humming quietly. Flight attendants moved like shadows down the aisle, offering water in hushed voices. Everything felt calm, ordinary, forgettable, until the speakers above their heads crackled to life with a voice that did not sound calm at all. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, his words shaking just enough for everyone to hear it. "This is your captain speaking. If there are any combat pilots on board, please come forward immediately." The sentence sliced through the silence. Heads lifted. Earphones were pulled out. Conversations died mid-word. People looked at each other in confusion, searching faces, trying to guess who might stand up. In row 10, a young woman who had been sleeping with her head tilted against the window blinked awake, the echo of that request ringing in her chest like an alarm only she could hear. Her name was Nora Hayes, 28 years old, a former fighter pilot with the Air Force. 2 years earlier, she had walked away from the cockpit after a mission that ended in fire, smoke, and names that never answered roll call again. Since then, she had done everything she could to disappear into normal life. Hoodies instead of uniforms, economy seats instead of cockpits, silence instead of call signs. Tonight, she was dressed like any other traveler, worn jeans, a gray sweatshirt, hair tied back in a simple ponytail. A paperback book lay half open in her lap. Before falling asleep, she had watched the clouds glow orange beneath the setting sun and told herself this flight was just a way to escape noise, memories, and questions she didn't want to answer. No one around her knew who she used to be. To the businessman beside her, she was "Miss, could you move your bag?" To the flight attendant, she was the quiet passenger in 10A. Nora stared at the call button above her head as the captain's words repeated in her mind. Combat pilots. Why would they need a combat pilot on a commercial flight? Her heart began to race, not from turbulence, but from memory. The last time she'd heard a call like that, it had ended with an explosion in the sky and a long list of condolences. She had sworn she was done. No more missions. No more flying. No more chances to fail the people who trusted her with their lives. A murmur rolled through the cabin, row by row. Did he say combat pilot? Is something wrong with the plane? Is this a joke? Nora swallowed hard. Instinct and fear started a war inside her chest. One part of her screamed, "Stay seated. Stay invisible. This isn't your responsibility anymore." The other part, the stubborn pilot that refused to die, whispered, "If you don't go, and something happens, can you live with that?" The businessman next to her chuckled nervously. "Like anyone on this flight has flown in a war," he muttered, shaking his head. Then he glanced at her and added, "Don't worry, miss. I'm sure it's nothing. These announcements are always overdramatic." He looked past her like she couldn't possibly be part of any solution. That tiny assumption, that casual dismissal, sliced deeper than he realized. He had no idea that the woman he was reassuring had once threaded a jet through enemy fire at twice the speed of sound. No idea that she had more hours in a cockpit than he had behind his office desk. Nora lifted her eyes to the aisle. Flight attendants were whispering urgently near the front. The plane shifted slightly, a subtle shudder that most people ignored, but she felt the wrongness in it immediately. The engine's hum had a strained, uneven timbre, like a runner already out of breath. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Her hands trembled as she unclipped her seat belt. That small click sounded impossible loud in her ears. She stood up slowly, feeling eyes turned toward her from nearby rows. The businessman frowned. "Where are you going?" She didn't answer. She just stepped into the aisle with her jaw clenched and her past catching up to her with every step she took toward the front of the plane. She had boarded this flight hoping to sleep through the sky. Instead, the sky was calling her back. And in that moment, no one in the cabin, not the crying baby, not the older couple holding hands, not the teenager filming everything on his phone, had any idea that the sleepy girl from row 10 might be the only reason any of them would ever step on solid ground again. All eyes followed Nora as she walked up the narrow aisle, the floor subtly vibrating beneath her feet. Conversations turned into whispers that floated behind her back. Is she going to talk to the crew? Maybe she's causing trouble. She doesn't look like a soldier. The closer she got to the front, the more intense the cabin felt. One flight attendant stood near the galley with a phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly to the cockpit. Another was half kneeling in the aisle, trying to calm a nervous passenger clutching his armrests. Above them, the fastened seatbelt sign glowed red, glowing like an accusation. You're supposed to be sitting down. Nora stopped just short of the curtain that separated the passengers from the world where the real decisions were made. A flight attendant noticed her and forced a polite smile over her fear. Ma'am, please go back to your seat. The captain wants everyone seated right now. Nora's voice came out steady, even though her heart was pounding. Your captain asked for a combat pilot, she said. I'm here to answer that. The attendant blinked, as if she hadn't heard right. You're a pilot? Her eyes flicked instantly to Nora's sweatshirt, her ponytail, her tired face. It was obvious she didn't see a war veteran. She saw a young woman who looked like she'd just finished grad school. Nora reached into her pocket with a slow, controlled motion and pulled out her worn military ID. Former Air Force. Fighter wing. I've flown combat sorties. I've landed damaged jets in worse weather than this. She swallowed. If your captain is asking for help, things are bad. You don't have time to decide if I fit your picture of a pilot. The attendant's cheeks flushed with shame. She didn't mean to doubt her, but years of assumptions didn't vanish in a second. She glanced at the ID, then at Nora's eyes, and what she saw there wasn't arrogance. It was calm, practiced focus. A person who had seen disaster before and still walked toward it. Wait here, the attendant said, voice suddenly respectful. She tapped on the locked cockpit door and spoke softly into the interphone. Within moments, there was the metallic click of bolts releasing. The door opened just enough for a tired, pale face to appear, the captain. He looked older than his uniform suggested, eyes ringed with exhaustion, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Behind him, red and orange warning lights flashed across the instrument panel like a storm of tiny alarms. The air in the cockpit felt different, thicker, urgent, pressed in by the invisible weight of responsibility. The captain's gaze moved quickly to Nora. You said you're a combat pilot? He asked, voice rough. Yes, sir. Nora Hayes. Former Air Force, she answered. If your call was serious, let me help. For a moment, he just stared, as if trying to decide if he dared trust the fate of hundreds of lives to a stranger who looked too young, too ordinary. Then the plane lurched suddenly, dropping a few feet in a jolt that drew a collective gasp from the cabin. Somewhere behind her, a child started to cry. The captain made his choice. He opened the door wider. Get in, he said. We don't have time. Nora stepped into the cockpit, the door closing behind her with a thud that sounded like a lock on her old life snapping open again. The space was tight, filled with blinking screens, analog gauges, and the low roar of wind against metal. On the right-hand seat, the co-pilot slumped unconscious, his head tilted to one side, oxygen mask crooked and useless. What happened to him? Nora asked. Likely a sudden medical event, the captain replied, voice clipped. We tried to revive him. No response. Autopilot failed 10 minutes ago, and we're in the middle of a storm system that wasn't on our original route. Some of our controls are sluggish. If I black out too. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Another warning beep cut through the cockpit, sharp and relentless. Nora slipped into the co-pilot's seat, gently moving the unconscious man's harness aside. Her hands hovered over the controls for a second. It felt like touching an old friend she had abandoned. She scanned the instruments, reading airspeed, altitude, attitude, fuel, engine status, her mind sliding back into a language she thought she'd forgotten. Numbers and angles and principles of flight swarmed her brain in an instant. The storm outside was clawing at the plane, throwing them through invisible pockets of air. This bird is heavy and hurting, she murmured, mostly to herself. The captain glanced at her. Can you handle this? Nora met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd left the military, she spoke her old self into existence. Call sign Skyhawk, she said quietly. I've flown worse. I'm with you. Outside the thin sheet of glass, lightning flickered across the clouds, illuminating the massive body of the jet like a ghost in the night. Inside, surrounded by alarms and fear, Nora wrapped her fingers around the yoke. In the cabin, passengers clung to armrests and loved ones, whispering prayers, arguments, apologies. None of them could see what was happening behind the locked door. They only knew this. The captain had called for a combat pilot, and somewhere, A stranger had stood up from row 10 as the aircraft shuddered again, a long, low tremor that rippled under Nora's hands on the yoke. The storm outside wasn't just turbulence. It felt like the sky itself was trying to tear the plane apart. Rain hammered the fuselage. Lightning flared like camera flashes around them. Left engines showing unstable output, Nora said, eyes darting to the display. The readings fluctuated like a heartbeat under stress. Hydraulics are degraded. Controls are sluggish on roll and pitch. The captain nodded grimly. We took a hard hit about 15 minutes before I made the announcement. Ever since, it's been a fight to keep this thing level. We tried rerouting, but the weather closed in faster than forecast. Our reserve fuel is being chewed up by detours and headwinds. So we can't circle, Nora said. We can't wait. We need a place to land, fast. The radio crackled to life, the distant voice of air traffic control fighting through static. They were already coordinating, searching for an alternate airport within range. Names of distant runways came and went, each with its own problems, storms, crosswinds, distance. As the controllers spoke, another sound crept into Nora's mind, uninvited and unwelcome. The echo of an explosion that had once turned her world into fire. She saw it in flashes behind her eyes, a crippled jet, a wing tearing free, a pilot's last broken radio call. She had been at the controls that day too, fighting a dying aircraft over a hostile landscape. She had landed. Her wingman hadn't. Guilt dug its claws into her chest. You failed them once, it whispered. What if you fail all of them now? Her fingers tightened on the yoke, knuckles paling. The plane jolted downwards, then leveled. The captain noticed the brief flicker in her gaze. You still with me, Skyhawk? He asked, not unkindly. She forced herself to inhale slowly, anchoring herself to the present, the weight of the yoke, the glow of the instruments, the sound of the engines. I'm here, she said, just listening to old ghosts. They're loud tonight. Make them useful, he replied. You've lived through bad air before. Use that. The plane dipped again, buffeted from the side. In the cabin, a drink cart rattled violently, sending plastic cups skidding. A teenage boy clutched his little sister's hand and whispered, Don't look out the window. Just don't look. A woman in the middle rows pressed her forehead against the seat in front of her, murmuring prayers under her breath. One row over from Nora's empty seat, the businessman who had dismissed her stared down the aisle, his heart pounding. He felt a strange shame now, remembering how easily he had assumed she was just another nervous traveler. He didn't know where she had gone, but part of him suspected, and that made his stomach twist. Back in the cockpit, ATC finally replied with a sliver of hope. A coastal air base, not originally on their route, had agreed to clear a runway for an emergency landing. It was just within their remaining fuel range, if the winds cooperated and nothing else failed. Coastal Air Base Orion, runway 16, emergency status, the controller's voice said through the static. You're cleared to divert. We've got emergency crews on standby. You're not alone up there. Nora exhaled slowly. The words "you're not alone" landed somewhere deep inside her. For the last 2 years, she had felt exactly that, alone with her failure, alone with replayed missions in the dark. Now, her hands were literally holding the lives of hundreds of strangers. Somehow, that felt less heavy than the memory of one lost wingman. Copy, Orion, she replied. This is Flight 702, Skyhawk at the controls. We're diverting now. She began a careful turn toward the new heading, compensating for the storm's claws with small, precise movements. The jet responded sluggishly, like a tired animal. Every correction had to be measured. Too sharp, and the airframe would be overstressed. Too gentle, and they'd drift into worse weather. Talk to me, Skyhawk, the captain said. What do you need? Trust, Nora answered quietly. And for you not to pass out. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. I'll do my best. As the minutes crawled by, Nora slipped deeper into the focused state she used to live in during missions. Outside, the sky was chaos. Inside, she carved out a tiny island of calm inside herself and held onto it fiercely. She thought of the people in the cabin, the little girl clinging to her mother, the elderly couple, the overconfident businessman, the flight attendants trying to smile through fear. They didn't know her name, her rank, or her call sign. But if she did her job right, they would get to keep all theirs. And for the first time in a very long time, Nora realized something. Maybe saving strangers could hurt a little less than failing friends, And maybe, just maybe, it could heal something inside her too. Time stretched and folded in strange ways as the plane clawed its way through the storm. Minutes felt like hours, and yet the distance to the emergency air base seemed to shrink too quickly when Nora glanced at the fuel gauge. The numbers were dropping faster than she liked. "We're tight on fuel," she said quietly to the captain. "There's no going around. No second approach. We get one shot at this." "Understood," he replied. His hands moved to adjust controls when needed, but more and more, the heavy work of fighting the storm rested in Nora's grip. His breathing was shallow, fatigue dragging at his features. Responsibility weighed on him, but he didn't try to reclaim control from her. Instead, he did something many never expected from a man in his position. He trusted. In the cabin, the fasten seatbelt sign still burned above every row. A flight attendant knelt beside a small girl who clutched a stuffed toy to her chest. "Is the plane going to fall?" the girl whispered. The attendant's voice trembled, but she forced a soft smile. "There's a very special pilot helping," she said. "Someone the sky listens to." The girl peered toward the front. "An angel?" "Something like that," the attendant replied. Back in the cockpit, another jolt threw Nora forward, her harness biting into her shoulders. A side wind tried to roll the jet, but she corrected, fighting the motion with calm, deliberate strength. Sweat trickled down her spine, but her hands did not shake. Suddenly, the captain's breathing changed, shallower, more uneven. His grip loosened slightly, and a grayish shade crept into his face. Nora's instincts flared. "Hey, stay with me," she said firmly. "Look at me, Captain." He blinked, forcing his eyes to focus. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him. "You're not fine," she replied. "If you go down, this whole cockpit goes quiet. Breathe with me, in and out. Don't try to be invincible. Just be here." Her words weren't just for him. They were for herself too. She had spent years trying to be invincible, breaking under the weight of it in silence. Tonight, she chose a different path. Shared responsibility, shared fear, shared courage. The radio crackled again. "Flight 702, this is Orion Base Tower. You are on final vector. Storm cell is moving east, but crosswinds are still strong. Visibility is poor, but improving. We've lit the runway like a Christmas tree for you. You are clear to attempt landing." "Orion, this is Skyhawk," Nora answered. "We're coming in whether the weather likes it or not." As they descended, the plane shook harder. The clouds outside thickened, turning the windows into murky gray screens. For a few terrifying moments, they were flying blind in a moving wall of mist. No lights, no horizon, only instruments. Nora's scars, inside, not on her skin, flared with memory. The last time she descended into a mess like this, she had lost someone. Her mind tried to replay it again, to drag her back into that moment. "Not this time," she told herself. "This time, you walk them all home." She lowered the flaps and stages, compensating for the drag, feeling the sluggish response. One engine coughed, a subtle vibration rippling through the yoke. "Don't you dare quit," she whispered to the machine. "You've carried them this far. You finished the job." The first faint glimmer of runway lights pierced the gray. At first it was just a smudge of brightness, then a thin glowing line beneath them, flickering through sheets of rain. The sight sent a shock of emotion through Nora's chest. Relief, fear, hope, all tangled together. "There it is," the captain said softly. The plane was high and fast, crosswind trying to shove them off course. Nora adjusted their approach, angling the jet slightly into the wind, planning to straighten out at the last possible moment. It was a maneuver she had learned in training, but rarely had to use at this scale. "Hold on," she murmured. "This is where it gets rude." In the cabin, the shaking intensified. People gasped as the plane briefly dipped, then climbed. Some cried openly now. Others stared straight ahead, frozen. The businessman from economy class, who had once looked at Nora with casual dismissal, now whispered, "Whoever's up there, please, please don't mess this up." The little girl with the stuffed toy squeezed her eyes shut and whispered, "Angel, please don't let us fall." Nora could not hear their words, but somehow, she felt them. The weight of hundreds of hopes pressed against her back like an invisible wind. For the first time since the day everything went wrong, she didn't feel crushed by that weight. She felt trusted, and that trust, fragile and unseen, gave her the strength to do what she had always been trained to do: fly through fear. The runway lights grew larger, stretching out beneath them like a glowing path carved into the darkness. Rain streaked across the windshield in chaotic lines, the wipers fighting to keep up. The crosswind slammed against the plane's side, trying to push them off the center line. Winds coming in hard from the right, the captain warned. "I see it," Nora replied. Her voice was calm, but inside, every nerve was tuned tight. "We're crabbing into the wind now. I'll straighten us just before touchdown." Altitude warnings chimed softly in the background. 500 feet. 400. 300. Each call-out was a reminder that there was no pause button, no time to second-guess. The plane yawed slightly, nose pointed a few degrees off the runway, heading to counter the wind. To anyone watching from the ground, it would look wrong, like the aircraft was trying to land sideways. But Nora knew exactly what she was doing. "Orion Tower, Flight 702 on final," she said into the radio. "We're committed. Flight 702, winds are gusting, but within tolerance." "You're looking good from here," came the reply. "We're all watching. Bring them home." The cabin was a different world entirely. Oxygen masks had stopped dangling, but people still gripped them like lifelines. A man whispered apologies to a wife sitting 3 countries away. A student silently promised to call his parents more if they survived. A grandmother clutched a pendant and prayed in a language she hadn't spoken since childhood. No one knew the name of the person holding their fate, but tonight, every breath they took depended on the steady hands of the woman they had once walked past without even seeing. 200 feet, the automated voice announced. Nora's focus narrowed until there was only the yoke in her hands, the runway lights ahead, and the roar of the wind against the body of the plane. She began to gently straighten the nose, aligning the jet with the runway while still compensating for the crosswind. Any harsh movement now could send them bouncing hard or veering off the tarmac. "Steady," she whispered. "Stay with me." 100. The ground rushed up to meet them. The crosswind shoved again, desperate to ruin everything in the final seconds. Nora fought back with smooth, practiced inputs. She had landed jets in war zones with fire on the horizon. She had brought herself home in machines more broken than this. 50. Nora pulled back gently, flaring just enough to soften the descent. The wheels kissed the runway. Once, then bounced, then thudded down firmly. The entire aircraft shivered at the impact. For a heartbeat, it felt like they might drift off the center line. "Come on," she hissed quietly. She deployed the reversers, applied controlled braking, and kept the nose aligned with tiny, precise adjustments. The engines roared in reverse thrust, the sound echoing through the cabin. The plane slowed, inch by inch, its speed bleeding away. In the cabin, silence held its breath with them. Then, as the aircraft finally rolled to a gentle crawl and stopped, a single sound broke the stillness, a choked sob of relief. It was quickly joined by another, and another. Then a wave of applause, shouts, cries, laughter, and prayers. Nora sat there for a second, still gripping the yoke, her heart thundering so loudly she could hardly hear the cheers. Her hands trembled now that it was over. She let out a shaky breath she felt like she'd been holding for years, not just minutes. The captain turned to look at her, eyes wet. "You just saved every soul on this plane," he said quietly. Nora shook her head, a small, exhausted smile forming. "No," she replied. "They saved me. I've been lost for a long time. Tonight, they gave me a reason to fly again." Emergency vehicles flashed blue and red along the runway edges, racing toward them. The storm still rumbled in the distance, but inside that cockpit, it finally felt like daylight. For the first time since the mission that had broken her, Nora didn't feel like a failure pretending to be ordinary. She felt like what she had always been, under all the guilt and fear, a pilot. When the cabin door finally opened and the night air poured in, it carried with it the smell of wet tarmac, fuel, and something else. Life continuing. Emergency crews stood ready outside, but inside, no one was rushing to leave. For a rare moment on a commercial flight, hundreds of strangers were united by one shared feeling: gratitude. Nora stepped out of the cockpit, shoulders tense, expecting to just blend back into the crowd, to disappear the way she always tried to. She didn't want a spotlight or a speech. She just wanted to walk down the stairs, find a quiet corner, and let her shaking legs remember how to stand on solid ground. Instead, as soon as she appeared in the aisle, the entire cabin seemed to inhale at once. Then, as if guided by some silent signal, people began to stand. Row by row, sector by sector. It started with a small ripple of applause, then grew into a rolling wave that filled the length of the plane. Some clapped, some cried openly, some pressed their hands over their hearts. The sound wrapped around Nora like a warm, unexpected embrace. The little girl with the stuffed toy squeezed past a flight attendant and ran down the aisle toward her. "Are you the angel?" she asked, eyes wide and shining with tears. Nora knelt so they were at the same height. "No," she said gently. "I'm just a pilot who didn't want you to be afraid." The girl threw her arms around Nora's neck anyway. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind them, the businessman from row 10 stepped forward, shame and awe written plainly across his face. I was sitting next to you," he said softly. "I thought you were just tired. I didn't even imagine you could," he swallowed, words failing him. "I'm sorry I underestimated you." Nora gave him a small, tired smile. "Most people do," she replied. There was no anger in her tone, just simple truth. That's why respect is important. You never know what someone has survived or what they're capable of doing when it matters. The flight attendants, who had seen their share of panicked and unkind passengers over the years, looked at her with open admiration. They had doubted her for a moment too, trapped by their own picture of what a real pilot looked like. Now, they knew better. As Nora walked slowly down the aisle toward the exit, hands reached out, not to grab, but to touch her arm, to murmur a thank you, to offer a blessing in quiet words. They weren't cheering for a celebrity. They were thanking a stranger who had carried their lives through a storm. On the tarmac, under the harsh white lights, paramedics moved toward the plane to take the unconscious co-pilot to an ambulance. The captain followed closely behind, refusing to leave his colleague's side. Before he stepped away, he turned back to Nora. "If it's all right with you," he said, "I'd like to file a report that includes your name. Not because you need recognition, but because what you did tonight deserves to be remembered." Nora looked up at the plane that had almost become a monument in the sky. She thought of her lost comrades, of the mission that had driven her into hiding from herself. Then she thought of the hugs, the tears, the applause, and the little girl who had called her an angel. "Use my name," she said quietly. "Not for me. For everyone who's ever been told they're too young, too small, too different, too anything. Let them hear that someone like them saved a plane once." He nodded, understanding more than she said. As the passengers were escorted toward the terminal, whispers spread. "She was in row 10. Did you see her? She looked so normal." "Yeah, that's the point." Later, when the story reached the news and social media, many would focus on the drama, the lightning, the failing systems, the emergency landing. But the part that would stay in people's hearts wasn't just the danger. It was the reminder that we never really know the battles someone has already fought or the strength they carry quietly inside them. Nora Hayes didn't leave with a metal pin to her chest or cameras flashing in her face. She walked out of the terminal with her small backpack over one shoulder, exhausted but lighter than she had felt in years. Somewhere deep inside, the guilt that had gnawed at her for so long loosened its grip. She had not brought back her lost wingman. But tonight, she had brought hundreds of strangers home. Life is unpredictable. Planes hit storms they never saw coming. People carry wounds no one else can see. Sometimes the person you assume is powerless, the woman sleeping by the window in row 10, the quiet stranger you barely notice, turns out to be the one who holds everyone's fate in her hands. Row 10 would never be just a seat number again. For the people on that flight, it would always be the place where a woman who wanted to disappear stood up when it mattered, stepped through her fear, and reminded the world that respect and humility are never wasted. And somewhere, beyond the clouds, the sky that once took so much from her seemed, at last, to give something back, peace. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today, and remember to like the video, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more cinematic stories about the hidden strength inside ordinary people.